Shall we do a bit of theatre, John, like a long time ago? Shall we starting? Is that a yes? Okay. It feels really like a performance now, being standing on the stage. So who is going first? Okay. Obviously, let's introduce ourselves first of all. We are representative of the deaf LGBT community here in Brighton and Hove, and we have various points to present to you. I think we have information from 92 to 95 about Punch and Judith, as well as a bit of history beforehand, just to understand how we got here. Then the interesting part, the more funny part, will be to talk about GSV, which is the gay sign variation, the alternative version of Polari. That was the spoken secret language, and so the interpreter is still going on now speaking, because obviously it takes much longer to present in English rather than in sign language. Has he finished yet? Okay, wow, I'm impressed. It's finished now. Let's carry on. Okay, shall we introduce ourselves? Okay, hello everyone. My name is Darren. Darren, your sign name is Darren like bitch, but no, that's let's not go there, okay? Because everybody think I'm a bitch, but I'm not anyway, so. Okay, just to say that I've been involved in the Punch and Judy club here in Brighton. I was the ex-chair, and then I was a visitor for a number of years because I moved away from Brighton, and then I moved back to Brighton as a resident more recently. So over to you, John. Hello, I'm John. I should introduce myself. I'm John Walker. My sign is representative of Scouts because I was involved in the Scouts. I was living in a different part of the UK, and then I moved eventually with my partner, which is the interpreter at the moment. We are husband now. Anyway, we met and eventually we moved to Brighton, and I have been a resident in Brighton since then for 22 years. I'm working at Sussex University as a researcher and now eventually as a lecturer. And I've been looking into history in general of the deaf community, specifically about the Brighton and Hove deaf community. And obviously in this occasion, I looked into the Brighton and Hove LGBT deaf community. And I remembered that Darren was involved, and that's why in Punch and Judith, the club, so that's why I got Darren to share this presentation with me, because he was the ex-chair. So obviously the other problem for us was that lots of people obviously had struggled to participate in this type of research because the confidentiality and sensitivity of some of this information. Darren didn't have a problem with that, and therefore that's why Darren is here with me. So Brighton as a city now it's been a contested space for the deaf community, okay? So the space is being fought for from different sides of the community, and everyone wanted a slice of it. So also let's remember that we do have a bicultural or bi-identity, so dual identity, because we are not only LGBT, we are not only gay, lesbian or bisexual, etc., but we also deaf, so we have that bilateral side. Has the interpreter finished yet? Yes, okay, we can go on. Next. We have to think that historically, that's why I'm presenting these bits of snippets of information. Brighton wasn't a city yet, it was a town. It was when Brighton was established as a town, in the construction of the city, of the town at the time, was the Cheeseman brothers. They were architects, and they were given the responsibility to build this area of Brighton, the north of Kent Town, and they decided architecturally to place deaf residential schools for the deaf and dumb, as they were called in those days. And he opened, so the school was opened in 1848. and then eventually it was closed before the 1940s because of the war incoming. Because of the worry of the bombs, like many children around the country in UK, the children were sent in more rural area of the country, away from towns and cities. So the school at the time was a sign language school. So sign language was used for the purpose of educating deaf children for English, so to learn English. However, there were already some indication that deaf children could be divided in those children that had better oral skills and better hearing, and those that didn't have oral skills or not much hearing enough, so those were eventually divided into sides. So when the children were arriving to school, age 7, not having much language skills, either in English or in sign language, they were taught by their peers. So they learned sign language by their peers, from their peers. So when they had been filled up enough with sign language from their peers, eventually the teachers took over and started to teach them English on top of that, using those skills. So if you don't mind me, John, if I intercede, but I think in that time there was not indication about LGBT life, okay, so in the deaf community. Probably there were deaf, lesbian and gay, but obviously we don't have any record of it at the moment. So that's why we are talking about this historical evolution to get to the point where we get to the LGBT community eventually. So still to understand the atmosphere were that the power was taken by hearing people. So this is the first founder of that school, William Slade, and then he passed on the business, let's call it, to his son, and then to the second son as well. So the first one became, the first one was the head of the school, and then the second son substituted his father as a head of the school again. And the first son eventually he became a reverend, and he moved away from the area. Obviously, they started using sign language for educational purposes, but then because of the pressure of oralism that was taking place around Europe, they decided to move away from sign language usage into the oral approach of education, because speech was becoming so much important in people's lives. So speech meant intelligence, so that's why the deaf and dumb then becoming the term that indicated stupidity. So if you were not able to be understood or be intelligible, you were considered stupid. I'm not going any further with that, but I thought it was important to introduce another fact, that these men, so the first son of William Slade, so William B. Slade, he later on became the first president or first chair of the British Deaf and Dumb Association. Okay, so he was, as a candidate, he was fighting against a deaf man that wanted to become chair, but because of the power, as I said, the power struggle was between deaf and hearing. Even deaf people voted for a hearing person to be in power of the association, because obviously they considered a hearing person a better choice, more intelligent to do the job. So it was in the 1890 that the protest about having the right for deaf people and the pressure of oralism and being freed from the oppression of the language and language rights started to come about in our community. Now, still relevant to Brighton, where I work in Sussex University, I eventually managed to find out there was a research center established in the Silverstone building, which was the educational building at Sussex University for many years. They were focusing on educational research. So from 1968 to 1977, this research center was working on and looking into how deaf children learning were affected by the methodology they were using, and obviously based on the fact that oralism was starting to fail. So they realized that pure oralism wasn't working anymore. So to teach English to deaf children, they needed to resort to other methodology, which were using some sign or form of visual rendition of English. So different tools, Darren is saying. Yes, correct. John mentioned Cute Speech and Meccaton and Paget and Gorman. All these systems that are fictitious systems. They're not real languages. They are just a rendition of English. So again, the point that I wanted to make is that our life as deaf people, our education, our identity is being controlled from external factors and mainly controlled by hearing people. So we were always subservient to the hearing world that was looking into our education, that were looking about organizing us as association and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's an historical note of certain importance. So, for example, just a personal experience, if I was assigning during my education, so I'm not talking about long time ago, I mean, it was 1977, but I was punished physically. I mean, I was slapped physically if I were found using sign language. So it's not, I'm not talking about centuries ago, okay? So part of that research center, they eventually they made a film in 1972, which is titled The Base of the Spiral, where they tried to capture how deaf children could be educated. And obviously one of the picture of the time, you can see that they had to rely on amplification, earlier amplification, and early amplification obviously were based on very rudimental at the time type of headsets, and children had to wear these headsets for hours and hours during the day, and when they were going home eventually they had red hot ears, literally, just because they have to be, you know, taught in that way. So there were different intervention, adaptation, modification. So deaf children were really guinea pigs. We've been experimented on, literally, based on the communication. And in many cases, there were not many successes either. So there were many failures. So they had a huge impact. So being used and abused during the daytime in these schools, obviously the only respite for us were during the evenings, during the social events where we could interact with each other, away from the teachers, away from hearing people. So we could use a sign language secretly, like a resistance, really. So the children were communicating with each other with sign language. They were creating poetry, jokes, humor, and that was in rebellion to how controlled we were during the day and being used and abused to some extent by the hearing tutors. So it was a bit of a fuck the hearing people that taking control to us, really. Being obviously in touch with many people here in the deaf community, I think this is quite common. We all found that whether we were in boarding school, residential school, or in mainstream school, we had to rediscover our identity, not only as the gay and lesbians and bisexual, etc., but also as deaf people ourselves, because that wasn't natural. It wasn't developed naturally. And the other things, just because obviously we were more often than not pushed into a residential school, like in many other residential schools, what happened is that many of these relationships, like same-sex relationship, took place or at least started during schooling. So some of the people were starting to experiment with sexuality or found themselves desperate enough not to having relationship outside of the school, so they were experimenting within the schools. I mentioned earlier on the British Deaf and Dumb Association, and in 1990 the patron of the British Deaf Association, obviously at the British Deaf and Dumb Association modified their names and became eventually British Deaf Association. The patron in the 90s was Princess Diana. And during the centenary celebration in the 90s that took place in the conference centre at the Brighton Centre here in Brighton, she participated. She was actually she gave the opening speech in sign language here in Brighton at the Brighton Centre. And the reason why she was in attendance was because she was also launching a book and a dictionary at the time. So she was also the patron of those publications as well. Actually, in the book, it was the first one that was collating very basic understanding of how deaf people lived, deaf history, how sign language was developed, and the fact that it was a language. So it was really a revolutionary publication in our world. And I'm sure if you want to come and see, there is actually also an introduction from Princess Diana. So the princess came to the conference, gave the opening speech, obviously gave her introductory congratulations to the organizer of the conference, and obviously she was only allowed to be in a specific type of area, but she wanted to talk to a person, or actually a deaf guy that was actually himself deaf, but also HIV positive, and we know that she was very good and been attending hospitals and so on. And the fact was that there was curtains around the conference where she was allowed to walk with safety and protection and not mixing with the community. However, she ignored that and she actually jumped over the cordons and met with this deaf guy, so she caused a bit of a stir during the conference, and she sat down literally with him and had a conversation with him. What is interesting is that at that conference, it was the first workshop that took place in the UK based on LGBT deaf awareness. So it was an awareness about deaf people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered. So the LGBT community have obviously a history as well, and we found that the first record in the UK of a deaf man was in the 1810, and he was accused of sodomy and eventually hanged. So that's the first record that we have found in the UK. So it's not Brighton-based information. However, that's the first things that we could find. I think Deaf Mesmac was men that have sex with men action in the community, was eventually based in London and was founded by two original members. Unfortunately, one of them have passed away last week, literally. And it was very active. It was very first LGBT based information and resources and form of support. And obviously the Punch and Judy in Brighton was eventually founded in 1992. So the first one was based in London, Brother and Sisters, and then many others were based in the following years in different parts of the UK. Birmingham, then Manchester, Cardiff, Nottingham, Brighton, Newcastle and Sheffield. There are other clubs that eventually were established in different parts of the UK. However, they were quickly closed because of lack of funding, and there were two other clubs in the UK that were established for specific type of interest. One was the Leather Gay Men Club, and the second one was called the Biscuit Club, which was actually the Bisexual Men Club. And there is also the Deaf and Hearing Lesbian group, which was called Darling, formed in 1918. It sounds like Darling, but yes, it's Darling, formed in 1988. The establishment of the Punch and Judy Club here in Brighton and Hove is because of the difficulties that gay men and women in Brighton and Hove found within the LGBT community, the hearing LGBT community. They were quite excluded. It was not easy to participate in clubs, in events and pubs. And therefore they decided to set up some social form of activities, and that's why the organization was established. I was actually living in London, but I became the chair or the vice chair because there was need of support for the organization. I had personally experience in organizing this type of association, so I was coming down regularly to from London here to Brighton. It took place in the Bulldog Tavern upstairs, and obviously there was no many other people willing to contribute towards the organization of these events and activities. And another person was David Moller, which actually lived in Eastbourne for many years and now lives in London, which I have managed to interview for a publication that was Queer in Brighton, published by it was not a political organization, it was just a social organization. The main aim was to socialize, and there was a newsletter, Deaf Flag, that was published regularly, and it was collating information from different clubs around the UK, including the Brighton one, and distributing information around the country. And that was at the time where we had to send this information by letter, okay? There was no emails or other means as yet. So there are different logos that were used representing Punch and Judy, and that's one of the leaflets that was obviously kept as documentation, and we have reproduced it here for you to see one of the annual general meeting publicity. And I also added that there were a number of pins that were created during those times and events. Some representative of the red ribbons, some of these were made actually by deaf men, and then there are obviously the pink triangles, the I love you American iconographic sign, and also the pin for the BSL, which is British Sign Language, the acronym that is used to talk about our language. So we also found a clip that is representative of when we all first met somehow. We all came together. There was an event, it was a Christmas event, first of all, here in Brighton, was organized by a friend of ours, and I met with Darren and other people here in Brighton, and then they invited me to an event in London, which was a New Year's Eve celebration of a club in London, and we all eventually met there, and Marco was attending from Italy at the time. So we have a clip of that, and it shows Darren. It's a surprise for you. You will see a representation of Darren identity at the time, and then other faces. Obviously, it was a party, and you can see that it's a party. Obviously, it's a New Year's Eve party. There is no sound because obviously it's been recorded by a deaf person. There is no subtitle either, so I'm not sure there is much communication anyway, or it's very visual anyway, so. So, and this was the table where, the one in drag was me. Well, if you didn't get it, just in case you didn't get it. And this was obviously a table where we all met eventually, because it was a table with Italian, and a friend from our friend of ours from Brighton was introducing us all together. This person standing, it was one of the earlier chair of the Punch and Judy Club here in Brighton as well. Marco came with some Italian friends, and because he had been living in Italy for a number of years, Robert, he wanted to practice his Italian sign language skills, and introduced himself, and then introduced other friends, and that's how we all met eventually. That was in the night between 93 and 94. Anyway, another things that we wanted to say was that although there were local and national organizations, deaf people are not they are not limited by boundaries. So we, as a community, as a LGBT community, we traveled a lot, because this event took place in many different parts of the world. This type of celebration of different LGBT deaf clubs were quite well publicized, so we tended to travel from one country to another. So we are quite an international community, and that's just a collection of events in 1995 throughout the year. Okay, so that was just 1 year. And so that's just a sample to give you a taste of what it was going on as a program, okay? So we didn't necessarily attend all of this, but obviously when we went, or someone of the club went to one of these events, obviously came back with lots of information and publicities and about what went on in other countries as well. So we were quite well informed of what happened around the world, even though there were not necessarily news or other type of information provided through that mean. That's, I think you've seen this already. It was another picture collating these pins. We mentioned Deaf Men's Mac already earlier on. And obviously the acronym stands for Men Who Have Sex with Men, Action in the Community. It was established obviously with support of the Terence Higgins Trust. One of the funders is David Pinkerton, and unfortunately passed away a week and a half ago. Rest in peace. He established this organization with support of another colleague, and he came down to Brighton to support the Punch and Judith Club, so he was invited several times. Unfortunately, it only lasted for 2 years, then was absorbed and merged with the Deaf Health Promotion of the British Deaf Association. So the issue was that especially deaf men, we have to admit, were very behind when it came to accessing information of HIV and AIDS. So it was really a big struggle for them to access this type of information about treatments and so on. So people even used the wrong signs were used in the medical profession. So instead of indicating the fact that a person has contracted HIV, because the English terminologies was HIV positive, they were signing HIV plus, which means positive, means that your results were positive, as in you are okay. So they misunderstood. Instead of thinking that you were obviously you had HIV, they thought actually they left literally the clinics thinking they were okay. So that's why they were obviously establishing this type of organization. And they merged eventually with the British Deaf Association in '94. And it was really appreciated here in Brighton to have such support from Deaf MESMAC, because obviously, as I said, there was a huge struggle, and already the deaf LGBT community were attracted in Brighton, so there was already a large number of deaf gay men and lesbians living in the area. There is another short film about the publicity that were created by MESMAC. And this was filmed during the event that I mentioned before in '93 or '4. So this is the 2nd of January of '94, and that was the memorial service that they established in London in St. Paul, behind St. Paul, and that's just a clip of Deaf MESMAC to show the publicity they created for deaf people especially. Some of the posters you might recognize yourself because they were the mainstream information as well. So. Because it was the memorial, this was the quilt that they created in memory of the people that passed away. So Deaf themselves, as you can see, they collated those mainstream publicity and leaflets and posters that worked visually and worked and had an effect within the community because they were quick to be understood, to see the message within it, and then distributed and used from not only locally and nationally, but also internationally as well. There were and again, there was information, but again, it was filtered through mainstream services. Well, now let's come to the more interesting parts, perhaps. As I mentioned before, the LGBT deaf world, if the LGBT community of hearing people is more, our is much smaller, okay? So it's a community within a community. And obviously going to clubs, going to mainstream events is quite difficult to communicate, and therefore it was very difficult to meet your partners, and deaf men and deaf women, obviously the number were very limited, so again it was very difficult to make connections. So what happened was that there was a huge publicity about encouraging LGBT members, hearing members, to come and attend and learn sign language. And many of the LGBT deaf community became sign language teachers to fish in the pond of hearing community. So, and that's how they form relationship. You hearing people could go in the clubs and pubs and met. That for us was the only way to deal with it. Okay, so we just created that trick. Not me. It wasn't me. Me neither. Marco already knew sign language when he came to the country, so I didn't have to teach you. Anyway, that's what happened. That was a natural. It happened within the straight deaf community as well, so it wasn't just the gay community, but that's how people expanded, went as visitors in the hearing world. So. And it did happen here in Brighton quite a lot, I have to say. There were a number of teachers of sign language. Hopefully you were not one of them, perhaps, I'm not sure. Maybe you were, I don't know. If you have learned sign language here in Brighton, you might have been exposed to one of those teachers. Anyway, there was also, what came out of that community was the development of a sign language variation used by the deaf gay community. And it was in a certain way a parallelism with the Polari. As you know, Polari uses specific terminology to indicate specific things within the gay hearing community, and deaf people did develop something in a similar way. I think you had found some information. Yes, I did. That exists already during the Second World War. So I met a deaf man, very, very old, and he told me a story that he met with other deaf men in bars and pubs where they were obviously hiding from other people looking at them, whether they were hearing or deaf, and therefore they knew that they had to use a secret language not to be understood or spotted by other deaf people that might came to those bars and clubs. So they created that secret language. I think most of the time they were taking place in London, then eventually disappeared and came back in the 80s again, where they used gay sign variation for a different purpose. So because it was a resurgence, instead of doing it for the secrecy of it, they were actually using it to demonstrate the fact they were gay. So it was a showing off. It was actually a type of identification. Look at me, I'm using a different type of signing. I'm being camp with my signing. I'm showing to you that I am gay. And that's why it was used in that way, and it carried on being used in that way until eventually it kind of disappeared. It was not used any longer. So, okay, just to explain some differences, there are some linguistic features that make it different. I know that obviously you don't know how to sign, but I will tell you some key points that will make you understand, perhaps when you see some of the example, the differences. So they use more feminine styles, so more frills. So they borrowed from the way women were signing. So instead of signing you, that's how you sign you. A woman would use perhaps a more delicate hand shape, and they might have used this sign to show you, the same concept of you. And therefore, gay men, instead of signing you as the index only, they borrowed that sign from the deaf woman. So they used more frill in the language. That's right. And also they were using the index, what do you think? I don't know. It doesn't come very natural to me, John is saying. It's more of a Darren thing. Yeah, right. So you're the butch one here. Okay, fair enough. So the other things is the position of the elbows, okay? The elbows goes up and down. If you're more masculine, you tend to put your elbows up. If you're more feminine, you put your elbows in. That's right, they're okay, wow. So you can see that's more feminine. So actually lesbian, interestingly enough, so deaf lesbians seems to be signing with elbows up, like go away, So they were signing like this. Okay, so it's more identifiable in that way. So it's a more male style of signing. And another thing is that we use more visual metaphors. So if you're talking about someone is going for a walk, if you're talking about a gay man, you almost indicate the fact he's going for a stroll in high heels. So a gay man mincing in the street would go and falling with the heels, not being able to so you could almost assign a story with the high heels. You could demonstrate there was always a terrible experience, and then you can go into the sexual one where the high heels are up in the air when you get Then there are other things where, aside the visual metaphors, there is always in sign language lip patterns just to make clarification of what you're saying. So there are some lip movement. Some are English-based, some are not. Gay men especially seems to be using more English patterns and English structure. This has been researched, and it seems because deaf gay men and lesbian, actually in this case, seems to have had a better education. So they seems to have struggled through education, but have reached a better education than the other deaf people in the community. Some of the signs have been used in BSL, it's been used from the LGBT community, so where gay sign variation, and they were actually borrowed and adopted back into the sign language, in the mainstream sign language. Sorry, the interpreter was saying to John and Darren that is losing the interaction, the very quick asides. So apologies. So the asides is being gone lost or not. I didn't see. So, okay. So the sign that were used that John was showing, the being formal, prim and proper, that was created for the gay sign variation, then was eventually absorbed by BSL, the mainstream language. So when deaf people want to indicate that someone is prim and proper, they seem to be using that sign. So we are giving you some examples. So we show you the same sign in BSL. I will show in the BSL version, the mainstream version, and then Darren will show you the GSV, the gay sign variation. And let's see if you can spot the differences, okay, between the two. So let's see if you get what is different. Fabulous. Fab. All right. all right. And so on. Sorry, I forgot. Oh, I made a mess of it. Okay, sorry, shopping. Because you always carry your handbag, isn't it? That's right. These were just a few examples, okay? So a bit of short, but there are many, 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 many more. That's it, really. Just to see that there is a difference between the mainstream sign language and the gay sign variation. So just a few indication and just an idea of it. So there is an intersectionality. What I meant was that obviously we are not just deaf, but we are deaf with other type of identities. There are obviously deaf people that are black, deaf, they might be gay as well, so and they might be not only from this country but also belong to another countries with a family from a different country as well, so they have those cultures and those identity as well. So we are really we do have intersectionality of our identities. So not only we try to be involved with the LGBT world, but also we have part of the deaf community as well. So sometimes we couldn't access that world in the hearing community. Sometimes we also were rejected by the deaf community as well, because although we were gay, we were deaf, we were gay. So sometimes there were these internal struggles. So 93, 94, there was this double oppression really from both communities, the hearing LGBT community and the deaf mainstream straight community as well. So, however, in 2000, with Pride, that year, there was a group of people that have attended the community, the Pride event, and they decided to go and visit the community, and they went into the SDA, the Sussex Deaf Association. There was a deaf club here in Brighton, and some of them were in drag, some of them were in leather, and obviously they were kind of the older section of the deaf community were actually in attendance that evening, and they were playing cards, pools, and etc. in the club. And obviously, as soon as these arrived from the Pride, you can imagine the reaction. Because they were based in a club where they were obviously under the control of the dioceses of sorry, I've lost the plot. Is the dioceses of outside Brighton, past Worthing, is Chichester, whatever. It's not that, but anyway, it doesn't matter. Yeah, and therefore they are under the church. All the deaf people were offended, and they made a complaint. They didn't want these people to be part of it. So they were literally banned from the club. So, and based on the fact they were gay and they were not discreet about it. So the support from, as I said, the hearing mainstream community was difficult, and the support from the deaf community was difficult as well. So there was a difficult relationship. What is interesting is that the LGBT community in Brighton and Hove is becoming smaller and smaller, because there is not, in 2016, there is not support as well, although and there is not collaboration either, because obviously the attitude is not necessarily changed, to be honest, from the hearing society that support the deaf community, the straight deaf community, okay? So there are many difficulties in the area still. Yeah. And we wanted to conclude and leave you with something more joyful, perhaps, or maybe not, I don't know. So it was published in the 1994 D-Flag magazine, and it was called the 12 Gays of Christmas. There is, I'm not asking you to sing, and especially don't ask me to sing, because I'm deaf, so you wouldn't want me to hear me singing these, however, so... but I thought it would be nice to show it to you through sign language, okay? So on the 12th day of Christmas, your true loves sent to me 12 hustlers humming, 11 poppers inhaling, 10 lords a-leaping, 9 ladies dancing, 8 clones are cruising, and that's the sign for cottaging, by the way. 7 studs are strolling. And studs perhaps could have been signed as well as with the pectorals and so on. Then 6 queens are queuing. 5 gold cock rings. 4 camping birds, as camping as being camp. 3 Frenchmen. 2 leather chops. And a chicken in a gay tree. That's before, wow, it was, I remember that newsletter even, actually, I still remember that one, it was good fun. And I think I would finish with that. I know that the interpreter has been sweating blood and tears and so poor him, never mind. Okay, thank you very much, thank you, bye.
Technology, particularly the internet and maybe dating apps, have changed your community?
Well, I'm sure deaf people use Grindr. I think yes, many of them perhaps use it. I know at least some of them do. There are other applications, apps that like Glider, where instead of using written form of messaging, you can actually sign So use a clip. You can record yourself and then send a clip with a visual rendition of yourself for signing. So some people seem to be using that, but I'm not sure if they use for that purpose. However, just to say that technology has influence in the community, yes, indeed. More deaf people use a smartphone just because you can create video, Skype, and other means to communicate visually. So yes, technology in general has changed the deaf community and deaf LGBT community. But we were talking about obviously time where that were not available. So I think in '92 we're using fax. And instead of writing, we're using pictorial representation. So in '95, I think there were a specific type. It was called the Brick. It was a Nokia smartphone where you could send text messages. Someone remembers it was a huge, very heavy mobile phone. And that's why some of these clubs have come to an end, because technology has come to support the community and made it much easier for the member of the community to communicate with each other. So they didn't necessarily they didn't need necessarily to meet physically any longer. So they could just communicate remotely. Back to the Brick, the Nokia mobile phone. And obviously when you put it in your jacket, in the pocket of your jacket, obviously your jacket fell on one side completely. So just I still have one at home. So it was interesting. Anyone wants it? It's kind of it's a relic. It's up for sale. I think £2,000 maybe. Sure.
Were there many women involved in the Punch and Judy Club?
Yes, there were. Yeah, it was gay and lesbian, and in those days it was only gay and lesbian. There was not, BNT involved as yet. Or at least people were not comfortable with being part of that community as yet. There were some transgender occasionally and some bisexual. There were perhaps more people being into drag and transvestites, let's say, type of participation rather than transgender. The transgendered community was really, really hidden within the deaf community. It wasn't as visible as it might have become nowadays. Okay? In 1970s was the period of liberalism, which affected a number of. So it wasn't radicalism as yet. So it meant that when eventually they had established the oralism systems, obviously there were people in employment that were working in that situation, in that settings. There were people that were earning wages and so on. So it was very difficult to sack them, although they realized it wasn't working. So rather than to do that and to substitute them with the new people, having to employ new people using sign language and so on, they reached compromises. So those people could learn a certain methods during times, and then trying to teach some of the children that they thought suitable with some of these methods, etc., and so on. So they tried to reach a compromise. Yeah. So for example, in my case, I was in an oral school, and one day, I think it was, literally from one day to another, from oralism, I started to be taught with cute speech. So I had to learn cute speech, which is a visual rendition of the sound, okay? So it's a phonetic base construction. So it was a waste of time, to be honest, because again, it taught you how certain words are pronounced, but if you don't know the meaning of the words, it's useless that you know how they're pronounced, really. So it was always out of the best intention, and in Italian we say of the best intentions are filled the graveyards. I've said in Italian, the best intentions are filled the graveyards. Okay? We've got one more, perhaps.
Are the deaf clubs less homophobic than they used to be?
Interestingly, I'm not sure if I can find the right term. There's still some attitude, let's say. They still, for example, say that, oh, a gay person has arrived. There is always this type of whispers. And again, sometimes you find that they don't quite respect your identity, but it's not as obvious as it was in the past. It's still hidden. I mean, it's still there, but it's not as obvious. It's not as oppressive, let's say, as it was in the past. So we do have a sign for gay that is accepted within any culture. But for example, when they want to talk secretly that you have arrived in the room, they spelled gay rather than instead using the sign. So they go, oh, the GAY has arrived in the room. Okay, so just to give you an indication. So and some others are still quite obvious, because, for example, it has happened quite recently that a deaf woman signed, oh, the poof has arrived. So again, some are quite forward with their thoughts. Let's say, like we were trying to say earlier on, we don't quite go to this place anymore. We just have created our own friendly community. So we participate to this type of mainstream events very rarely and occasionally when it's needed. And so we have our own personal groups. So it's not even a community per se, they're just a personalized group of choice, so friends of choice. Yeah. I think perhaps the interpreter have hit the roof now, so no, we haven't finished. We want to carry on. Let's carry on. Let's carry on. Shut up now.